The air hung thick over the Texas prairie in the summer of 1854, heavy with dust and the weight of watching eyes. In the border town of Marshall, where Louisiana met Texas, and the line between slavery and freedom blurred into something dangerous and undefined, a woman named Sylvie walked through the marketplace with her head held at precisely the angle required, not too high, not bowed in submission. The calculation of survival had become instinct, carved into her movements by 15 years of bondage. She was 28 years old. Though she looked older, the sun had etched lines around her eyes, and her hands bore the scars of cotton thorns and cooking fires. But there was something in her gaze that made slave catchers uncomfortable when they looked too long, a kind of stillness that suggested she was always thinking, always measuring distances and possibilities. If you're discovering this story for the first time, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We bring you forgotten histories of resistance every week. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and consider joining our members club to support more stories like Sylvie's. Marshall sat at the crossroads of commerce and cruelty. Cotton flowed east toward Louisiana. Enslaved people flowed west toward the deeper south, where prices were higher and questions were fewer. The town's prosperity was built on both. Its streets were lined with auction houses and trading posts, its hotels filled with planters calculating their investments in human flesh. And somewhere in the gaps between those transactions, in the spaces where systems became sloppy with confidence, people like Sylvie learned to see opportunities. She belonged, if that word could ever apply to a person held as property, to a man named Clayton Hawthorne, a cotton merchant who prided himself on being more enlightened than his neighbors. He allowed Sylvie to work as a seamstress, permitted her to keep a small portion of her earnings, even tolerated her teaching other enslaved people to read in the hidden hours before dawn. He spoke of these permissions as kindness, as evidence of his refined character, but Sylvie understood they were simply longer chains, designed to make her complicit in her own captivity. The trick that would change everything began with a conversation she wasn't supposed to hear. Hawthorne kept an office above his mercantile store, and Sylvie often brought him his evening meal there. He had a habit of forgetting she was present once the food was delivered, of treating her as furniture while he conducted business. That evening in late July, two men sat across from him, slave catchers from Louisiana, tracking a family that had disappeared 3 weeks earlier. "Trail goes cold at the Sabine River," the older one said, his voice rough with frustration. "They're getting help. Someone's moving them through and moving them fast." Hawthorne leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. "The Underground Railroad doesn't run this far west. You're chasing ghosts. Then explain how a man, his wife, and 3 children vanish without a trace. Explain how they crossed 60 miles of open territory without being seen." Sylvie stood perfectly still by the door, her face arranged in the expression of patient emptiness that white people expected, but her mind was racing, cataloguing every word. She knew the family they were discussing, had seen them briefly at a prayer meeting 2 months before. The husband's name was Marcus, and he had the hands of a blacksmith and the eyes of a man who had already made his decision. "Perhaps they're better at hiding than you are at finding," Hawthorne said dismissively. "Or perhaps they're dead in a ditch somewhere and you're wasting my time." The younger catcher leaned forward, his face flushed with anger. "There's money in this, Clayton. Good money. If someone's running a route through here, we need to know, and we need to stop it." After they left, Sylvie cleared the dishes and descended the stairs to the kitchen. Her hands shook slightly as she scraped the plates, not from fear but from the dangerous electricity of an idea taking shape. She had spent years watching and listening, mapping the patterns of power in Marshall. She knew which sheriffs could be bribed and which were true believers. She knew which roads were patrolled and which were forgotten. She knew that the catchers were right about one thing. People were moving through, finding paths to freedom that shouldn't exist. What she didn't know yet was that she would become the reason those paths stayed open. The next morning, she went to the market earlier than usual. The stalls were just opening, vendors arranging their goods in the blue-gray light before dawn. She moved between them with purpose, selecting vegetables and fabric, exchanging the brief, coded pleasantries that served as currency among enslaved people in public spaces. But she was looking for one person specifically, an old man named Cyrus, who sold herbs and claimed to remember Africa. She found him at his usual spot, his table covered with bundles of dried plants that smelled of earth and secrets. Cyrus was perhaps 70, his face mapped with wrinkles that seemed to shift like water when he smiled. Some people said he was touched by spirits. Others said he was simple. Sylvie knew he was the most careful person she had ever met. "Morning finds you early," he said, not looking up from arranging his wares. Morning finds everyone eventually, she replied, the standard response. He glanced at her then, and something passed between them, recognition of a kind that went deeper than words. You seeking something particular? Information about plants that help with sleep. My mistress has been troubled. It was a lie transparent enough to be a message. She had no mistress. Everyone knew she belonged to Hawthorne. But Cyrus nodded slowly, his hands never pausing in their work. Sleep can be hard to find when the mind won't rest, he said. Sometimes a person needs to travel to find the right remedy. Sometimes that travel takes them far from home. How far? Depends on what they're running from and what they're running toward. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes, conducted in full view of a dozen other people. To anyone watching, it was simply a domestic purchasing herbs for her owner's household. But Sylvie left with more than dried lavender. She left with confirmation that there was indeed a network, that Marcus and his family had made it through, and that the paths they traveled were precarious, dependent on courage and luck in equal measure. That night, lying on her pallet in the small room behind Hawthorne's kitchen, Sylvie made her decision, not to run, not yet. That would be too simple, too expected. Instead, she would do something far more dangerous. She would make herself useful to the very system that hunted her people, and in doing so, she would learn everything she needed to dismantle it from within. The idea was audacious to the point of madness. She would approach the slave catchers and offer herself as an informant. She would claim to have overheard things, to know routes and safe houses. She would feed them information, just enough truth mixed with careful lies to make them believe she was genuine. And in the process, she would learn their methods, their contacts, their patterns of movement. She would become their trusted source while simultaneously becoming the Underground Railroad's most valuable asset. The risk was absolute. If they suspected her, she would be sold south to the sugar plantations, where life expectancy was measured in years rather than decades. Or worse, she would be made an example of, her death drawn out as a warning to others. But the alternative, continuing to live in the careful, calculated survival that passed for existence, had become unbearable. She spent 3 days preparing. She crafted her story with the precision of a seamstress working on a wedding dress, every detail interlocking with the next. She would claim to have family connections in Louisiana, to have heard things through the network of enslaved people who carried messages between plantations. She would present herself as someone motivated by pragmatism rather than ideology, someone who understood that cooperation with the catchers might earn privileges, might create opportunities for her own advancement within the limited world available to her. It was a performance that required her to embody everything she despised. But Sylvie had learned long ago that survival often demanded the temporary embrace of degradation. The question was whether she could maintain the performance long enough to achieve something that mattered. On the 4th day, she saw her opportunity. The 2 catchers had returned to Marshall, and she watched them enter the tavern where they were staying. She waited until late afternoon, when the establishment was busy enough to provide cover, but not so crowded that her presence would be remarkable. Then she walked through the door with her head down and her shoulders rounded, the posture of submission so ingrained it required no conscious effort. The older catcher, she had learned his name was Garrett, sat at a corner table with a bottle of whiskey and a ledger open before him. He looked up when she approached, his expression moving through confusion to suspicion in the space of a heartbeat. "Can I help you?" His tone made it clear he thought she was lost or simple. "Sir, I heard you're looking for information about runaways." The words came out hesitant, frightened. She let her voice shake slightly. "I might know something." Garrett's eyes narrowed. He gestured to the empty chair across from him, and Sylvie sat, keeping her gaze lowered. Around them, the tavern continued its business. White men drinking and talking, a few enslaved people serving drinks or cleaning tables. No one paid attention to a black woman speaking quietly to a white man. Such conversations happened all the time in the economy of bondage. "What's your name?" "Sylvie, sir. I belong to Mr. Hawthorne." "I know Hawthorne. Why would his property be bringing me information?" She took a breath, letting the pause build tension. "Because I have family in Louisiana, sir. My cousin, she works for a family near Shreveport. Sometimes we send messages back and forth, and she told me things about people moving, about how they do it." Garrett leaned back, studying her. The younger catcher had materialized beside the table, drawn by the conversation. His name was Thaddeus, and he had a reputation for violence that preceded him into every room. "And why would you share this information with us?" Thaddeus asked, his voice sharp with suspicion. Sylvie raised her eyes just enough to meet his, letting him see the calculation there, the suggestion of someone making a difficult choice out of necessity rather than loyalty. Because, sir, if people keep running and getting caught, the whole system gets tighter, gets harder for everyone. But if the routes could be closed quietly, if the right people could be warned or redirected, maybe there's a way through this that doesn't end with everyone suffering more. It was a masterpiece of manipulation, suggesting she was motivated by a desire to protect her community while actually appearing to betray it. The catchers exchanged glances, and Sylvie could see the wheels turning. They were accustomed to buying information from enslaved people, but usually through intimidation or crude bribery. The idea that someone might approach them voluntarily, with a sophisticated understanding of the larger systems at play, was both unusual and appealing. "What exactly do you know?" Garrett asked finally, and Sylvie began to spin her web, feeding them pieces of truth wrapped in carefully constructed lies, places that had once been safe houses, but were now abandoned, routes that had been used months ago but were no longer active, names of people who had already escaped beyond their reach. She gave them just enough to seem valuable, just enough to make them believe she had access to the network they sought to destroy. They thought her trick was a joke at first, a desperate woman trying to buy favor with scraps of outdated information. But 10 nights later, everything would change. 10 nights later, no slave catcher would feel safe in Texas, because Sylvie's real trick wasn't the information she gave them. It was what she learned from them while they thought she was serving their cause. The first test came faster than Sylvie expected. 3 days after her initial meeting with Garrett and Thaddeus, they summoned her to a warehouse on the eastern edge of Marshall, a sprawling wooden structure that smelled of cotton and rot. She arrived at dusk, her heart maintaining the steady rhythm she had trained it to keep, even when fear clawed at her throat. The building was nearly empty, just a few bales stacked in the corners, and the 2 catchers waiting in the shadows like predators. "We followed your information about the Beaumont place," Garrett said without preamble. His voice echoed in the cavernous space. "Found nothing. No signs anyone had been there in months." Sylvie had anticipated this. The Beaumont property had indeed been a safe house, but she had known it was abandoned before she mentioned it. The key was in how she responded to their skepticism, with just enough defensiveness to seem genuine, just enough uncertainty to seem human. "My cousin told me people were using it back in spring," she said, letting frustration edge into her voice. "Maybe they moved on. Maybe they got spooked. I can't control what white folks do, sir. I can only tell you what I hear." Thaddeus stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the tobacco on his breath. "Or maybe you're wasting our time. Maybe you're playing us for fools." She met his eyes then, holding his gaze for exactly 2 seconds before looking away, long enough to show courage, brief enough to show proper deference. "If I wanted to waste your time, sir, I wouldn't have come to you at all. I got nothing to gain from that. But if you don't want what I know, I can keep it to myself and go back to mending Mr. Hawthorne's shirts." The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled taut. Sylvie kept her breathing even, her hands still at her sides. She had learned years ago that stillness was a form of power, that the person who could remain calm while others grew agitated often controlled the outcome. Garrett broke first. "We need current information, not history. If you want this arrangement to continue, you need to bring us something we can act on." "Then ask me the right questions," Sylvie replied. "Don't send me out blind and expect me to read your minds." It was a calculated risk, pushing back with something close to impertinence. But she had judged them correctly. They were men accustomed to dealing with enslaved people who either cowered or lied clumsily. Her combination of directness and apparent practicality was novel enough to be intriguing. Over the next hour, they questioned her about patterns and procedures. How did messages move between plantations? Who could be trusted to carry information? Which overseers were sympathetic and which were vigilant? Sylvie answered carefully, mixing truth with invention, always aware that every word was both a performance and a gathering of intelligence. She learned that Garrett and Thaddeus were part of a larger network of catchers that stretched from Louisiana to Arkansas, coordinated by a man named Cyrus Pemberton, no relation to the herb seller, who operated out of New Orleans. She learned they received bounties not just for captured runaways, but for information that led to arrests of white abolitionists or free black people aiding escapes. She learned they kept detailed records, that they worked with federal marshals under the Fugitive Slave Act, and that their network included informants in nearly every major town along the border. Most importantly, she learned they were afraid. Beneath their bluster and brutality, there was genuine fear. The number of successful escapes was increasing, and each one represented not just lost bounty money, but a crack in the system they depended on. The Underground Railroad was becoming more sophisticated, more organized, and the catchers were struggling to keep pace. When Sylvie finally left the warehouse, the night had deepened to full darkness. She walked back toward Hawthorne's property, with her mind racing, cataloguing everything she had heard. The moon was a thin crescent, providing just enough light to navigate by. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, and she felt the familiar tension that came with being outside after dark, the knowledge that her presence in the streets could itself be grounds for punishment. But she wasn't going directly home. Instead, she took a detour through the narrow alley behind the Baptist church, where a loose board in the fence created a gap just wide enough for a person to slip through. On the other side was a small cemetery, and in the far corner, beneath an oak tree whose roots had lifted and cracked several headstones, was where she had arranged to meet Cyrus. He was already there, a dark shape barely distinguishable from the shadows. They didn't speak until Sylvie had crossed the cemetery and positioned herself with her back to the tree where she could see anyone approaching. "They took the bait," she said quietly. Cyrus nodded. His face was invisible in the darkness, but she could hear the slow, thoughtful sound of his breathing. "And what did the fish tell you while you were hooking them?" She relayed everything: the network structure, the contact in New Orleans, the records they kept, the patterns of their patrols. Cyrus listened without interrupting, and when she finished, the silence stretched for nearly a minute. "You're playing a dangerous game, daughter," he said finally, "dancing on a knife's edge. Every day of my life is a knife's edge. At least this way the blade is moving somewhere useful. What do you need from us? Information I can feed them. Real enough to keep them believing, useless enough not to hurt anyone. And I need to know the actual routes, the real safe houses, so I can protect them." Cyrus shifted, and she heard the soft rustle of cloth. "The network doesn't trust easy. You understand that. There are people who've been building these paths for years, and they got reason to be careful about who knows what. I understand, but those catchers are going to keep pushing me for current information. Eventually they'll test me with something that matters. I need to be able to give them something that looks real. What if they catch you in a lie?" Sylvie smiled in the darkness, though there was no humor in it. "Then I'll be no worse off than I am now. We're all one mistake away from the auction block, Cyrus. You know that as well as I do." They talked for another 20 minutes, working out a system of communication. Cyrus would serve as her connection to the broader network, passing information both directions. When Sylvie needed to share what she learned from the catchers, she would leave a mark on the fence behind the church, a specific pattern of scratches that would tell Cyrus a meeting was needed. When the network had information for her, Cyrus would leave certain herbs in specific combinations at his market stall, and she would know to return to the cemetery after dark. It was elaborate, perhaps unnecessarily so, but complexity created safety. The more layers between any two people in the network, the harder it was for the entire structure to collapse if one person was compromised. As Sylvie finally made her way back to Hawthorne's property, the weight of what she had set in motion settled over her shoulders like a physical burden. She had placed herself at the center of two opposing forces, each one capable of destroying her completely. The catchers would kill her if they discovered her true purpose. The Underground Railroad would abandon her if they suspected she was genuinely collaborating with their enemies. And Hawthorne would sell her south if he learned she was involved in anything beyond her assigned duties. The mathematics of survival had never been so complicated or so precarious. The following week established the rhythm that would define the next 2 months. Sylvie met with Garrett and Thaddeus twice weekly, always in different locations. The warehouse, a clearing outside town, once in the back room of a trading post. She fed them carefully curated information, each piece calibrated to seem valuable, while actually being worthless. She told them about a safe house that had burned down 3 months earlier, about a conductor who had died of fever, about routes that had been abandoned when railroads changed their schedules. And with each meeting, she extracted more intelligence. She learned the names of other catchers in their network, the schedules of their patrols, the methods they used to track people. She discovered which sheriffs were on their payroll and which federal marshals could be counted on to look the other way when convenient. She mapped the invisible architecture of the system, designed to keep her people in chains. At night, she passed this information to Cyrus, who distributed it through channels she didn't fully understand, to people she would never meet. And slowly, the network adapted. Routes shifted to avoid known patrols. Safe houses moved to locations outside the catcher's awareness. Conductors changed their methods, varying their patterns to prevent prediction. The catchers noticed the change, but they attributed it to random variation rather than systematic counterintelligence. They were hunting individuals, not fighting an organization. The concept that enslaved people might be capable of sophisticated coordination was outside their framework of understanding. To them, runaways were isolated, desperate, driven by instinct rather than strategy. The idea that someone might be deliberately feeding them misinformation while simultaneously strengthening the very network they sought to destroy was simply unthinkable. That blindness was Sylvie's greatest advantage. She existed in a space her enemies couldn't imagine, invisible not because she was hidden, but because they lacked the conceptual tools to see her clearly. But invisibility was not the same as safety. There were close calls, moments when the web of lies threatened to collapse. One evening in late August, Thaddeus questioned her about a specific family, a mother and 2 sons who had disappeared from a plantation 30 miles south. Sylvie had heard about them through the network, knew they were currently hiding in a barn owned by a free black farmer, waiting for the next leg of their journey. "Word is they're still in the area," Thaddeus said, watching her face carefully. "Someone's protecting them. Someone local." Sylvie kept her expression neutral, thinking fast. "I heard something about that, but what I heard was they were moving east toward Louisiana. Someone said they had family in Natchitoches." It was a lie, but a plausible one. The family did have distant relatives in Natchitoches, information the catchers could verify. What they couldn't know was that those relatives had died years ago, that the connection was historical rather than current. "You sure about that?" Garrett asked. "No, sir, I'm not sure about anything. I only know what people tell me, and people lie. But that's what I heard, and it made sense at the time." The catchers exchanged glances, and Sylvie felt the moment balance on a knife's edge. Then Garrett nodded. "Natchitoches, we'll check it out." They left Marshall the next day, heading east on a wild chase that would keep them occupied for a week. And during that week, the family they were hunting moved north under cover of darkness, guided by conductors who knew the catchers were elsewhere. By the time Garrett and Thaddeus returned, frustrated and empty-handed, their quarry was in Arkansas, moving steadily toward Missouri and freedom. But that success created a new problem. The catchers were becoming frustrated with their lack of results, and frustrated men were dangerous. They began to suspect that someone was actively working against them, though they still didn't connect it to Sylvie. Instead, they assumed there was a white abolitionist in the area, someone with resources and connections. Their response was to become more violent, more aggressive in their methods. They began raiding known gathering places, interrogating enslaved people with increasing brutality, offering larger rewards for information. The pressure on the community increased, and with it the risk that someone would break, that the network would be exposed. Sylvie watched this escalation with growing concern. Her trick was working. She was successfully misdirecting the catchers and protecting the Underground Railroad. But the cost was rising. People were being hurt in the catchers' frustrated searches. The question was how long she could maintain the deception before the weight of it crushed everything she was trying to protect. The answer came on a humid night in early September, when everything Sylvie had built nearly came apart in a single devastating moment. She had arranged to meet Garrett and Thaddeus at their usual spot in the warehouse, expecting a routine exchange of information. Instead, she found them waiting with a third man, a tall figure with cold eyes and an expression of absolute certainty. "This is Cyrus Pemberton," Garrett said. "He's come up from New Orleans to personally oversee operations in this territory." Sylvie's heart stopped. She kept her face carefully neutral, but her mind was racing through possibilities and consequences. The man from New Orleans, the one who coordinated the entire network of catchers. If he had come personally, it meant something significant had happened, and if he suspected her, there would be no escape. Pemberton studied her with the detached interest of a man examining livestock. "So you're the source that's been feeding my boys information. Tell me, Sylvie, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer. Do you know what happens to people who lie to me?" The warehouse seemed to contract around her, the walls pressing in. This was the moment she had known would come eventually, the test she might not survive. Everything depended on her next words, on her ability to maintain the performance under direct scrutiny from someone far more intelligent and experienced than Garrett and Thaddeus. Sylvie met Pemberton's eyes, holding his gaze with the steady calm of someone who had nothing left to lose. "Yes, sir," she said quietly. "I expect they die badly." Pemberton's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Interest, perhaps, or the cold calculation of a predator reassessing its prey. He walked a slow circle around Sylvie, his boots echoing against the warehouse floor. She remained perfectly still, her hands loose at her sides, her breathing even. Years of slavery had taught her that stillness could be a form of defiance. that refusing to show fear was sometimes the only power available. "My men tell me you've been providing information for almost 2 months now," Pemberton said, his voice carrying the refined accent of New Orleans money. "Routes, safe houses, patterns of movement. But the interesting thing is we haven't caught a single runaway based on what you've given us. Not one. Now, how do you explain that?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Sylvie could feel Garrett and Thaddeus watching her, their earlier confidence in her usefulness now mixed with suspicion. This was the precipice she had known was coming, the moment when her carefully constructed lies would either hold or shatter completely. "I explain it the same way I'd explain anything about desperate people running for their lives," she said, her voice steady. "They change their plans. They hear rumors. They get spooked and shift direction. I tell you what I know when I know it, but by the time your men get there, the situation's already different. That's not my fault, sir. That's just the nature of hunting people who know they're being hunted." It was a good answer. Logical, reasonable, impossible to disprove, but Pemberton was clearly not a man who accepted reasonable explanations when his business was failing. "Or," he said, stopping directly in front of her, "you're feeding us old information deliberately. You're giving us places that have already been abandoned, routes that are no longer in use. You're playing a game, and you think you're clever enough to win it." Sylvie felt the danger crystallize around her like ice. This was the edge of the blade, the moment that would determine whether she lived or died. She could deny it, could maintain the performance. Or she could do something far more dangerous. She could tell a truth so unexpected that it might actually save her. "You're right," she said quietly. The words fell into the silence like stones into water. Garrett took a step forward, his hand moving toward his belt. Thaddeus muttered something under his breath, but Pemberton raised a hand, signaling them to wait. "Go on," he said. Sylvie chose her words with surgical precision. "Some of what I've given you has been old information, not because I'm trying to trick you, but because current information is dangerous. People talk, sir. If I start asking too many questions about active routes, about who's moving right now, people get suspicious. And if people get suspicious of me, then I become useless to you. So I give you what I can verify, what I can confirm through multiple sources, what won't get me killed for asking. Is it perfect? No, but it's real, and it's more than you had before I came to you. It was a masterwork of misdirection, admitting to the lesser crime to avoid accusation of the greater one. She was confessing to being cautious and self-protective, which any rational person in her position would be, while simultaneously denying the deeper betrayal. Pemberton studied her for a long moment. The warehouse had grown darker as they talked, the last of the daylight fading beyond the high windows. In the dimness, his face was all angles and shadows. "You're intelligent," he said finally. "More intelligent than these two gave you credit for." He glanced at Garrett and Thaddeus with something close to contempt. "Which means you're either exactly what you claim to be, a practical woman trying to navigate an impossible situation, or you're something far more dangerous." "I'm trying to survive," Sylvie said. "Same as everyone else." Survival. Pemberton seemed to taste the word. "Yes, I suppose that's the motivation that drives most commerce in our particular industry." "Very well, Sylvie. I'm going to give you an opportunity to prove your usefulness. There's a situation developing that requires precision, and if you can help us resolve it, then perhaps I'll believe you're the asset my men think you are." He gestured to Garrett, who produced a folded piece of paper from his coat. "There's a white man operating in this territory, a conductor, we believe, though we haven't been able to identify him. He's been moving people through Marshall for at least 6 months, possibly longer. We know he has connections to a church somewhere in town, and we know he's being protected by someone with significant resources. I want his name." Sylvie took the paper, unfolding it to reveal a crude sketch. A man with a beard and a hat pulled low, the kind of generic description that could fit a dozen people. But the detail that caught her attention was a notation at the bottom. "Seen near Baptist Church, September 3rd, evening." Her mind raced. The Baptist church was where she met Cyrus. If the catchers had been watching it, if they had seen people coming and going, then the entire network might already be compromised. But the fact that they were asking her for information suggested they didn't have enough evidence yet, that they were still assembling pieces of a puzzle they couldn't quite complete. This is the moment where everything changes. If you're following Sylvie's dangerous game, hit that like button and subscribe. We're about to see whether her trick can survive this test. Drop a comment telling us what you think she should do next, and join our members club to access behind-the-scenes research on stories like this. "I'll need time," she said carefully. "If there's a white conductor operating openly, he's being careful. But people talk and people see things. Give me a week." "You have 3 days," Pemberton said. After that, I'll assume you're either incompetent or complicit, and either way, you'll become a liability I need to eliminate." The threat was delivered with the casual certainty of a man who had eliminated many liabilities before. Sylvie nodded, folding the paper and tucking it into her dress. 3 days. She left the warehouse with her heart pounding, but her pace measured and steady. The street outside was empty except for a few drunks stumbling between taverns. She walked toward Hawthorne's property, but her mind was already racing ahead, calculating possibilities and dangers. The conductor they were looking for didn't exist, at least not in the way they imagined. The person moving people through Marshall wasn't a white abolitionist with church connections. It was a network of enslaved and free black people working in careful coordination, with Cyrus at its center. But the catchers couldn't conceptualize that reality. They were looking for a white savior, because that was the only narrative they understood. Sylvie could use that blindness. She could give them what they expected to find: a white man, a church connection, a tidy story that confirmed their assumptions. But creating a convincing fiction would require more than just words. It would require physical evidence, corroboration, details that could be verified, and it would need to happen in 3 days. She didn't go to the cemetery that night. Instead, she waited until the following evening after she had finished her work in Hawthorne's kitchen and the household had settled into sleep. Then she slipped out through the back door and made her way through the darkened streets toward the edge of town, where the free black community lived in a cluster of small houses beyond the reach of most white oversight. Cyrus lived in a cabin that leaned slightly to the left, as though weary from years of supporting its own weight. Sylvie knocked 3 times, paused, then knocked twice more, the signal they had agreed upon for urgent meetings. The door opened almost immediately, and Cyrus pulled her inside without a word. The cabin's interior was lit by a single candle, its flame casting dancing shadows across walls lined with dried herbs and mysterious bundles. Another person was present, a woman Sylvie had seen at prayer meetings but never spoken to directly. She was perhaps 40, with intelligent eyes and hands that bore the scars of fieldwork. "This is Rebecca," Cyrus said. "She's one of the coordinators. I thought she should hear this directly." Sylvie explained the situation quickly: Pemberton's arrival, his ultimatum, the sketch of a non-existent white conductor. As she talked, Rebecca's expression grew increasingly grim. "They've been watching the church," Rebecca said when Sylvie finished. "We knew they were getting more aggressive, but we didn't know they'd identified the location. If they start surveillance in earnest, if they start documenting everyone who comes and goes, the whole network collapses," Cyrus finished. "Everyone who's been using that route becomes a target. So we give them what they're looking for," Sylvie said. "We create the conductor they expect to find." Rebecca frowned. "You mean fabricate a person? Invent someone who doesn't exist?" "Not invent. Redirect. There's a white man who comes to the church sometimes, Reverend Morrison's nephew from Louisiana. He visits every few months, stays for a week or 2, then leaves. He's due to arrive next week for his regular visit. We can make it look like he's the conductor." "But he's innocent," Rebecca protested. "You'd be putting a noose around an innocent man's neck." "He's white," Sylvie said flatly. "The worst that happens to him is he gets questioned, maybe watched for a while. He's got family connections, he's got the protection of his race. He'll be uncomfortable, but he won't hang. Now compare that to what happens if they keep digging and find the real network. How many black people die then? How many get sold south? How many children get separated from their families?" The mathematics of survival had never been so brutal or so clear. They could sacrifice the comfort and safety of one privileged white man, or they could watch the entire network and everyone it protected burn. Cyrus was nodding slowly. "It could work. Morrison's nephew is the right age, the right build. He matches the sketch well enough, and his timing arriving right as they're intensifying their search, that would seem like perfect confirmation to them." "We'd need evidence," Rebecca said, her voice reluctant but practical. "Something physical they can discover, something that makes them certain they've found their man." Over the next hour, they planned the deception with meticulous care. Sylvie would tell the catchers she had heard rumors of a white man from Louisiana, asking questions, someone connected to the church but visiting from outside. She would express uncertainty, would seem reluctant to accuse a white man without solid proof. That reluctance would make the information seem more credible. Meanwhile, Cyrus and Rebecca would plant evidence: a few abolition pamphlets in the church basement, positioned where they might plausibly have been hidden by someone using the space, a coded letter that could be accidentally discovered in the nephew's room at the boarding house where he always stayed. Small things, each one innocent on its own, but suggestive when combined. The nephew himself would never know he was being used. He would arrive in Marshall as planned, conduct his business, and leave, possibly under increased scrutiny, possibly questioned by authorities, but ultimately unharmed because nothing they found would actually prove criminal activity, just enough smoke to convince the catchers they had found the fire. It was cruel in its way, but cruelty was the currency of the world they lived in, and Sylvie had learned to spend it strategically when necessary. She returned to Hawthorne's property in the deep hours of the night, exhausted but clear-eyed about what needed to happen. The next 2 days were a carefully choreographed performance. She let Garrett and Thaddeus see her asking questions in the market, appearing to investigate on their behalf. She made a show of being nervous, of checking over her shoulder, of behaving like someone who was getting close to dangerous information. On the 3rd day, she met them at a new location, a clearing outside town where they could talk without being observed. Pemberton was not present, which meant her life depended entirely on convincing his subordinates. "There's talk," she said carefully, "about a white man from Louisiana. He visits Marshall regular, stays at the boarding house on Market Street. People say he asks questions that don't quite fit his stated business, but he's white. And he's got connections, so I can't be certain." "Name," Thaddeus demanded. "Morrison, Jacob Morrison. He's a nephew to the Reverend at the Baptist Church, which would explain the connection you were asking about." Garrett and Thaddeus exchanged glances. "When is he here?" "Due to arrive tomorrow or the day after. Usually stays about 10 days. She watched them absorb this information, saw the pieces clicking into place in their minds. A white man with church connections visiting from Louisiana at regular intervals, asking unusual questions. It fit their narrative perfectly because she had crafted it to fit. "If you're wrong about this," Garrett said slowly, "if you're sending us after an innocent man, then I'm wrong and you waste some time watching him. But if I'm right, then you've got your conductor. And either way, that's the best I can do with 3 days' notice and no resources except my ears." It was enough. They dismissed her with instructions to stay alert, to report anything unusual about Morrison's activities, and Sylvie walked away knowing the trap was set, knowing that in a few days the catchers would believe they had solved their problem, and in believing that, they would stop looking for the real network. But as she made her way back through the early evening light, she felt the weight of what she had done settle over her like a shroud. She had just weaponized an innocent man's identity, had made him a target, even if that target would never quite reach him. The moral mathematics were clear: one privileged white man's discomfort versus countless black lives saved, but clarity didn't make the choice feel clean. This was what resistance looked like in the architecture of bondage, not heroic gestures or noble sacrifices, but careful calculations of harm and necessity. She was protecting her people by any means available, even if those means required her to become someone she barely recognized. The trick had worked. 10 nights after her first meeting with the catchers, the entire territory was in upheaval, but not in the way anyone expected. Jacob Morrison arrived in Marshall on a Tuesday afternoon, stepping off the stagecoach with the distracted air of a man whose mind was occupied with ledgers and business contracts rather than the dangerous web being woven around him. He was 32 years old, clean-shaven where the sketch had shown a beard, but otherwise close enough to the description that confirmation bias would do the rest of the work. He checked into his usual room at Mrs. Hendrick's boarding house and went to visit his uncle at the Baptist Church, precisely as he had done on a dozen previous visits. He had no idea that Garrett and Thaddeus were watching from across the street, documenting his movements with the careful attention of men who believed they were finally closing in on their prey. Sylvie knew because she had positioned herself to see both Morrison and his watchers. She stood in the market with a basket of vegetables, apparently shopping for Hawthorne's evening meal, but actually monitoring the convergence of forces she had set in motion. The risk was immense. If Morrison did anything unexpected, anything that contradicted the narrative she had constructed, the entire deception could collapse. But she had chosen him precisely because he was predictable, because his patterns were established and routine. Over the next 3 days, those patterns held. Morrison met with merchants to discuss cotton prices. He attended prayer meetings at his uncle's church. He took his meals at the boarding house and retired early each evening. He was, in every observable way, exactly what he appeared to be, a businessman with family connections conducting routine affairs. But Garrett and Thaddeus saw something different. They saw a man with regular access to the church where runaways gathered. They saw someone whose visits coincided with periods of increased escape activity, a correlation that Sylvie had carefully pointed out, knowing they would find meaning in what was actually coincidence. They saw a pattern because they were looking for one, and Sylvie had given them just enough threads to weave the tapestry they expected. The planted evidence did the rest. On Morrison's fourth day in town, Thaddeus discovered the abolition pamphlets hidden in the church basement, tucked behind a loose board exactly where an anonymous tip had suggested he look. The pamphlets were old enough to seem credible, but not so old as to be obviously planted. Each one bore notes in the margins, comments and observations that suggested they had been studied carefully by someone planning operations. The handwriting in those margins belonged to a free black man named Thomas, who had died 2 years earlier. Rebecca had kept some of his papers, and she had spent hours copying his distinctive script onto the pamphlets. The effect was to create evidence that predated Morrison's involvement, suggesting he had inherited materials from a previous conductor rather than creating them himself. 2 days later, a coded letter was discovered in Morrison's room during a search conducted while he was at the church. The letter was a masterpiece of misdirection, vague enough to avoid specific accusations, detailed enough to seem incriminating. It referenced packages and shipments and routes, using the standard euphemisms of Underground Railroad correspondence, but carefully avoiding any language that could definitively prove criminal intent. Mrs. Hendrick, who had found the letter while cleaning, brought it to the sheriff with the nervous certainty of a woman who believed she had uncovered something significant. The sheriff, who was on Pemberton's payroll, brought it to the catchers, and the catchers, already primed by their surveillance of Morrison, saw it as confirmation of everything they suspected. Sylvie watched the mechanism of false conviction grind forward with a mixture of satisfaction and horror. Morrison was questioned, politely at first given his race and status, but with increasing pressure as the evidence mounted. He denied everything with the genuine confusion of an innocent man, which only made him seem more suspicious to people convinced of his guilt. His uncle vouched for him, which was interpreted as either misplaced family loyalty or possible complicity. Within a week, Morrison had become the primary target of every slave catcher operating in East Texas. His movements were documented, his conversations monitored, his business dealings scrutinized for hidden meanings. The entire apparatus of pursuit and surveillance that had been threatening the real Underground Railroad had pivoted to focus on a man who had never aided a single escape. And in that pivoting, space opened up. The actual routes operated with reduced pressure. Conductors moved more freely, knowing the watchers were looking elsewhere. Families who had been waiting for the right moment to run found their opportunities. The network breathed and expanded in the shadow of misdirection, but Sylvie understood that this reprieve was temporary. Eventually, the catchers would realize Morrison was a dead end. Eventually, they would return their attention to the real network, possibly with increased anger and determination. She had bought time, nothing more. The question was how to use it. She met with Cyrus and Rebecca in the cemetery again, the three of them speaking in whispers beneath the oak tree, where the dead kept their secrets. The night was humid, the air thick with the promise of rain that never quite fell. "Morrison is going to leave," Rebecca reported. "His business is finished, and his uncle is urging him to go before things get worse. He'll be gone by the end of the week. And when he leaves, the catchers will either follow him or realize they've been chasing shadows," Cyrus added. "Either way, our window is closing." Sylvie nodded. She had been thinking about this problem for days, turning it over in her mind like a stone examined from every angle. "We need to give them something else to chase, something bigger than one conductor." "What do you mean?" Rebecca asked. "Pemberton came here because the escapes were increasing, because they were losing control. We've temporarily convinced them Morrison was responsible, but that just moves the problem. When he leaves and the escapes continue, they'll know someone else is operating. We need to make them believe the entire network has been disrupted, that whatever system existed has collapsed." "How do we do that?" Cyrus's voice was skeptical. "We stop running people for a while. 4 weeks, maybe 6. We tell everyone to stay put, to wait. The catchers will see the sudden drop in escape activity and assume their increased surveillance has worked. They'll believe they've won, that they've scared people into submission, and in believing that, they'll relax their vigilance." Rebecca was shaking her head before Sylvie finished. "You're asking people to stay in bondage when they're ready to run, asking them to wait while their children are at risk, while they're being beaten and worked to death. That's not a small thing." "No," Sylvie agreed quietly. "It's not. But the alternative is trying to move people through a territory where every catcher is on high alert, where they're expecting deception and watching for it. How many people die trying to run through that? How many get caught and sold south? We can save more lives by waiting than by rushing. The moral mathematics again, the brutal calculus of choosing between bad options and worse ones. They argued for an hour, Rebecca advocating for continued operations, Cyrus trying to find a middle path, Sylvie insisting that strategic pause was the only option that preserved the network's long-term viability. Finally, Rebecca sighed. It's not my decision alone. This needs to go to the coordinators, to the people who've been building these routes for years. But I'll carry your argument to them. The meeting broke up with nothing resolved, but Sylvie knew her logic was sound. The network would see it eventually, would recognize that sometimes the most effective resistance was the kind that looked like surrender. She was right. Within a week, word came through Cyrus that the coordinators had agreed to a temporary suspension of operations. The routes would go quiet for 6 weeks, giving the catchers time to believe they had achieved victory. During that pause, the network would rebuild, would identify new safe houses, would establish new patterns that didn't match the old surveillance data. Morrison left Marshall on a Friday morning, still confused by the attention he had received, but relieved to be returning to Louisiana. Garrett and Thaddeus watched him go, then reported to Pemberton that their primary suspect had fled the territory, which in their minds confirmed his guilt, even if they lacked evidence sufficient for arrest. Pemberton himself departed a few days later, satisfied that his presence had restored order to a chaotic situation. He left instructions for continued surveillance, but with reduced intensity. The crisis, he believed, had passed, and in the quiet that followed, Sylvie continued her work. She still met with Garrett and Thaddeus, still provided them with information, now focused on monitoring the situation to ensure the network stayed collapsed. She reported on prayer meetings and gatherings, always careful to describe them in ways that suggested fearful people intimidated into submission rather than organized resistance, preparing for its next phase. The catchers ate it up. They wanted to believe they had won, and Sylvie fed that desire with carefully crafted observations that confirmed their assumptions. She became less a spy and more a validator of their success, which was exactly the role she needed to maintain access to their plans and movements. But the strain was taking its toll. Every conversation with the catchers required her to embody a version of herself she despised, the complicit slave who traded her people's safety for personal advantage. Even though she knew it was performance, even though the reality was exactly opposite, the weight of pretending ate at her sense of self. She began to wonder if you could wear a mask so long that it became your face, if playing a role with sufficient commitment eventually transformed you into the thing you were only supposed to be pretending to be. The doubts crystallized one evening in late October when she encountered a woman named Sarah in the market. Sarah was perhaps 20, recently purchased by a planter who had a reputation for brutality. She was pregnant, visibly so, and her eyes held the desperate calculation of someone weighing impossible choices. "I heard you know things," Sarah whispered, as they passed near each other between the stalls. "I heard you might know ways out." Sylvie's heart clenched. The network was still quiet, still waiting out the suspension period. There were no active routes, no conductors moving through Marshall. Telling Sarah to run now would be sending her to almost certain capture or death. "Wait," Sylvie whispered back. "Not now. Soon, but not now. I can't wait. He's going to sell my baby. Soon as it's born, he's going to sell it away from me. I can't." Sarah's voice broke. "Please, I heard you help people." The moment stretched between them like a chasm. Sylvie could feel the weight of every choice, every compromise, every strategic decision pressing down on her shoulders. The network had to stay quiet for the strategy to work, for the long-term survival of the routes. But standing in front of her was a pregnant woman who couldn't afford to think long-term, who needed help now or never. "Give me 3 days," Sylvie finally said. "I'll find a way, but you have to trust me, and you have to wait." Sarah nodded, her eyes bright with desperate hope, and slipped away into the crowd. And Sylvie stood there with her basket of vegetables, knowing she had just made a promise she had no idea how to keep. That night, she didn't go to the cemetery. Instead, she went to Hawthorne's office above the mercantile store, waiting until he had finished his ledgers and poured himself his usual evening whiskey. She knocked on the doorframe, and he looked up with mild surprise. "Sylvie, is something wrong?" "Mr. Hawthorne, sir, I need to ask you something, and I need you to hear me out before you answer." He studied her for a moment, then gestured to the chair across from his desk. It was a liberty, allowing an enslaved person to sit in his presence, but Hawthorne prided himself on his liberal attitudes. "Go ahead." Sylvie sat, her mind racing through the approach she had prepared. "There's a woman, Sarah, belongs to Mr. Patterson. She's pregnant and she's afraid. Patterson's got a reputation for selling children away from their mothers, and she's desperate. I'm asking if you might consider purchasing her, not as an investment but as a kindness. She's a good worker, and she could help around the house here." Hawthorne's eyebrows rose. "You're asking me to buy someone?" "I'm asking you to save someone," Sylvie corrected gently. "I know you think of yourself as different from other owners, Mr. Hawthorne. I know you believe you treat your people better. Here's a chance to prove it's not just words." The silence that followed was heavy with calculation. Hawthorne was a businessman first, but he was also a man who enjoyed thinking of himself as enlightened. Sylvie was gambling that his vanity might be stronger than his financial prudence. "Patterson won't sell cheap," he said finally, "especially not a pregnant woman. That's 2 potential assets. Then maybe you tell him you're interested in her skills, not the child. Maybe you negotiate. I don't know the business side of it, sir. I just know that woman needs help, and you're in a position to provide it." Hawthorne drank his whiskey, his eyes on the ledger before him, but his mind clearly elsewhere. "Why do you care? You don't even know her." "Because every woman in bondage is me," Sylvie said quietly. "Every child sold away could be mine. I don't have children, Mr. Hawthorne, but I understand what it means to be treated as property, and I'm asking you, as someone who claims to see us as human, to act like it." It was the most direct she had ever been with him, the closest she had ever come to acknowledging the fundamental cruelty of the system they both inhabited. She saw something shift in his expression, discomfort perhaps, or recognition of truths he usually kept at arm's length. "I'll think about it," he said finally. "I'm not promising anything, but I'll think about it." It wasn't an answer, but it was possibility. Sylvie thanked him and left, knowing she had done all she could through that channel. The rest would depend on whether Hawthorne's self-image as a benevolent master was strong enough to overcome his instinct for profit. She spent the next 2 days in a state of anxious waiting, maintaining her routine while her mind churned through contingencies and alternatives. If Hawthorne didn't purchase Sarah, if the woman's situation became immediately desperate, what then? Run her through an inactive network? Try to hide her locally and risk exposing safe houses that needed to remain secret? The answer came on the 3rd day, when Hawthorne informed her that he had negotiated a purchase. Sarah would be transferred to his household within the week. He presented it as a business decision, needing additional domestic labor, but Sylvie saw the slight self-satisfaction in his expression and knew he was pleased with himself for being magnanimous. She found Sarah that evening and told her the news. The relief in the woman's face was so profound it was almost painful to witness. "Thank you," Sarah whispered. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Sylvie replied. "Hawthorne's better than some, but he's still a master. You're still in chains. This just bought you time. But sometimes time was everything. Sometimes buying someone a few months or a year was the difference between survival and destruction. And in the brutal mathematics of bondage, Sylvie had learned to count even small mercies as victories. As October faded into November, the suspension period approached its end. The network prepared to reopen its routes with new precautions and modified patterns. Garrett and Thaddeus had relaxed their vigilance, convinced that their aggressive response had intimidated the local population into submission. Pemberton sent occasional inquiries from New Orleans, but seemed satisfied that the situation was under control, and Sylvie continued her dangerous dance, feeding the catchers enough information to keep them complacent while preparing for the moment when everything would shift again. She had bought the network 6 weeks of breathing room, had protected countless people from capture, had even managed to save one pregnant woman from immediate disaster. But the cost was accumulating. Every meeting with the catchers, every lie she told, every moment she spent pretending to be their ally, carved away another piece of her sense of self. She was winning the war of deception, but she was beginning to wonder what would be left of her when it was over. The answer to that question would come sooner than she expected, in a confrontation that would either vindicate her strategy or destroy everything she had built. The confrontation began with something small, a detail so minor that most people would have overlooked it entirely. But Thaddeus had always been the more suspicious of the two catchers, the one whose paranoia occasionally bordered on insight. And on a cold morning in mid-November, that paranoia finally found purchase on something real. He came to Sylvie while she was at the market, pulling her aside with a grip on her arm that was just shy of painful. His face was flushed with anger or excitement. She couldn't immediately tell which. "The Morrison letter," he said without preamble. "The one we found in his room. There's something wrong with it." Sylvie's heart began to pound, but she kept her face carefully neutral. "Wrong how?" The paper. I showed it to a stationer yesterday. Asked him about the type. He said it's from a mill in Virginia that only started production last year, but the letter's dated 1852. Someone made it to look old, but they used paper that didn't exist when it was supposedly written. The world seemed to tilt slightly beneath Sylvie's feet. It was such a small thing. Rebecca had been so careful about the handwriting, about the language and phrasing, but she had overlooked the paper itself, a tiny detail in an elaborate deception, but tiny details were often what brought down kingdoms. Maybe someone copied an old letter onto new paper, Sylvie suggested carefully. Or maybe the date is wrong. Or maybe, Thaddeus said, his voice dropping to something dangerous, someone planted that letter to make us think Morrison was the conductor. Someone who wanted us looking in the wrong direction while the real network kept operating. He was staring at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. She could see him working through the logic, connecting pieces that she had hoped would remain separate. If the letter was fake, then everything about Morrison was potentially suspect. And if Morrison had been a misdirection, then who had the means and motivation to create such an elaborate deception? I don't understand what you're suggesting, Sylvie said, putting just enough confusion in her voice to sound genuine. I told you what I heard about Morrison. If that was wrong, then I was wrong. But I can't control what people tell me, unless you weren't wrong by accident, unless you were wrong on purpose. The accusation hung between them like a blade. Around them, the market continued its morning business. Vendors calling out prices, customers haggling. The ordinary commerce of a town built on slavery. No one was paying attention to a white man questioning a black woman. Such scenes were too common to merit notice. Why would I do that? Sylvie asked. What would I possibly gain? I don't know yet, but I'm going to find out. He released her arm and walked away, leaving Sylvie standing between the vegetable stalls with her mind racing through possibilities and consequences. The deception was unraveling. Not completely, not yet, but a thread had been pulled, and if Thaddeus kept pulling, the entire fabric would eventually come apart. She needed to warn the network immediately, needed to implement whatever contingency plans existed for exactly this scenario. But she also needed to maintain her routine, needed to avoid any behavior that would confirm Thaddeus's suspicions. The performance had to continue even as the stage was collapsing beneath her. That evening, after completing her work in Hawthorne's kitchen, she made her way to the cemetery, but she approached more carefully than usual, taking a circuitous route and pausing frequently to ensure she wasn't being followed. The November night was cold, the air sharp with the promise of winter. Her breath came out in visible clouds as she slipped through the gap in the church fence. Cyrus was already there, along with Rebecca and two others Sylvie didn't recognize, a man and a woman, both with the weathered faces of people who had lived hard lives. They stood in a tight circle beneath the oak tree, speaking in whispers that stopped when Sylvie approached. "We have a problem," she said without preamble, and explained about Thaddeus and the paper, about the thread that had been pulled and might unravel everything. The group listened in silence, and when she finished, the man she didn't know spoke first. His voice was deep and carried the accent of somewhere farther south. "This is what happens when we play games with white folks' investigations. I told you all this plan was too clever by half. It bought us 6 weeks, Rebecca counted. 6 weeks when 37 people made it through to freedom. 37 lives that wouldn't have been saved if we just kept running routes under full surveillance. And now we've got a suspicious catcher who knows something's wrong and a spy who's compromised." "I'm not compromised yet," Sylvie said firmly. "Thaddeus suspects, but he doesn't know. There's a difference. A difference that'll get you killed when he figures it out," the man replied. "You need to run tonight. We can get you on a route north, have you in Arkansas by the end of the week." Sylvie shook her head. "If I run, that confirms everything. Thaddeus tells Garrett, Garrett tells Pemberton, and they come down on this entire community like God's own judgment. Every safe house gets raided, every conductor gets arrested, every route gets burned. Is that what you want?" "Better than them having a spy they can torture for information," the woman said quietly. "No disrespect intended, sister, but everyone breaks eventually, and you know too much." It was true, and the acknowledgement of it sent a chill through Sylvie that had nothing to do with the November cold. She did know too much. Routes and conductors, safe houses and signals, the entire architecture of resistance that the network had built over years. If the catchers took her, if they applied the kinds of persuasion they specialized in, she would eventually tell them everything. The human body and mind had limits, and those limits could be systematically discovered. "So what do you suggest?" Cyrus asked, his voice tired. We can't send her north because that exposes us. We can't leave her here because that endangers her. What's the third option? The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of impossible choices. Sylvie looked at each of them in turn, seeing fear and determination in equal measure. These were people who had risked everything to build something that mattered, and now that thing was threatened by the very strategy that had temporarily protected it. There is a third option, Sylvie said slowly, the idea forming even as she spoke. I go to them first, before Thaddeus can build his case, before he can convince Garrett or get word to Pemberton. I go to them and I confess. Confess to what? Rebecca asked. To being a double agent, to feeding them false information deliberately. But I don't confess to working for the Underground Railroad. I confess to working for myself. She could see them trying to understand, so she continued. I tell them I was playing both sides, that I figured out there was money in knowing where runaways were going, so I fed the catchers bad information while selling good information to the people actually running the routes. I make it about greed instead of resistance. I make myself an opportunist instead of a freedom fighter. They'll still kill you, the man said flatly. Maybe, but maybe not. If I'm just a greedy woman trying to make money off everyone's misery, that's something they can understand. That fits their worldview, and if I offer to genuinely work for them now, if I claim I want to switch sides because the railroad can't pay as well as they can, they might believe it. They might keep me alive as an asset. And if they don't believe it, Cyrus asked, then I die. But I die without giving them the real network, because I'll maintain the fiction that I was only in it for money, that I don't actually know the true routes or conductors. I protect you all, even in dying. It was a plan born of desperation, but it had a certain terrible logic. The catchers needed to believe in greed because greed was a motivation they trusted. They could understand someone trying to profit from chaos. What they couldn't conceptualize, what their entire worldview prevented them from seeing, was the possibility of systematic, organized resistance by people they considered fundamentally incapable of sophisticated thought. Rebecca was shaking her head. It's too dangerous. You're gambling your life on them believing a lie that makes you look terrible. I've been gambling my life since I first approached them, Sylvie replied. This is just a different bet on the same game. And if it works, if I can convince them I was only ever about money, then they stop looking for an organized network. They start looking for individual opportunists, which is a completely different kind of search. The debate continued for another hour, voices rising and falling in the darkness beneath the oak tree. The man, Sylvie learned his name was Joseph, argued vehemently for getting her out immediately. Rebecca wanted to wait to see if Thaddeus's suspicions would fade without confirmation. Cyrus kept returning to the question of what would do the most good for the most people, his voice weary with the weight of impossible decisions. Finally, the unnamed woman spoke again. It should be her choice. She's the one putting herself in danger. She's the one who knows the catchers best. If she thinks this plan has a chance, then we support it. And if it goes wrong, we honor her sacrifice by protecting what she died for. There was a finality to the words that settled the debate. After a few more minutes of discussing logistics and contingencies, the meeting broke up, but Cyrus pulled Sylvie aside as the others disappeared into the darkness. You don't have to do this, he said quietly. That man, Joseph, he's right that we can get you north. You've done enough, more than enough. No one would blame you for saving yourself. Sylvie smiled, though there was no joy in it. Wouldn't they? I'd blame me. Every person who got caught because I ran instead of staying. Every family that got broken apart because the network collapsed. I'd carry that weight forever. At least this way, if I die. I die having tried to protect something bigger than myself. There's nobility in survival too, Cyrus said. Don't forget that. Maybe. But I think there's also a point where survival for its own sake becomes just another kind of death. I'm tired of surviving, Cyrus. I want to live, even if only for a few more days. And the only way I know how to live is by choosing my own path instead of having it chosen for me. They stood in silence for a moment, two people connected by shared danger and shared purpose. Then Cyrus embraced her briefly, a gesture that carried the weight of goodbye even if neither of them said the word. Sylvie returned to Hawthorne's property and spent the night lying awake on her pallet, rehearsing the performance she would have to give. The confession needed to be crafted with the same care she had applied to every other deception, detailed enough to be believable, vague enough to avoid exposing real people, consistent enough to withstand questioning. She would tell them she had family in New Orleans, people who had connections to slave traders who were willing to pay for information about escape routes. She would describe a system of monetary exchange that never actually existed, but that fit perfectly with the catcher's assumptions about human nature. She would present herself as someone who had gotten greedy, who had thought she could manipulate both sides for profit, and who was now willing to genuinely cooperate because she realized the Underground Railroad couldn't match what the catchers could pay. It was a character assassination of herself, a performance that required her to embody every negative stereotype they held about people like her. But if it worked, if they believed it, then the network would survive. The roots would stay hidden. The people she had spent months protecting would continue to find their way to freedom. The next morning she asked Hawthorne for permission to run an errand. He granted it absently, barely looking up from his newspaper. She walked through the town with her head high and her heart pounding, making her way to the warehouse where she knew Garrett and Thaddeus would be. They were there, poring over maps and documents. When she entered, Thaddeus reached for the pistol at his belt, but Garrett held up a hand. "Sylvie, we were just talking about you." "I expect you were," she replied. "And I expect Thaddeus has told you about his concerns regarding the Morrison letter. He's right to be concerned. There are things I need to tell you, things I should have told you from the beginning." She saw the glance they exchanged, suspicion mixed with vindication. They gestured for her to continue, and Sylvie took a breath, preparing to become the person she needed them to believe she was. "I haven't been entirely honest with you about my motivations," she began. "When I first came to you, I said I wanted to help because I thought cooperation might earn me privileges. That was partly true, but the real reason was money." She told them the story she had crafted, watching their faces for signs of belief or doubt. She described fictional contacts in New Orleans, invented transactions, fabricated payment methods. She confessed to playing both sides, to feeding them bad information while selling good information to conductors. She made herself venal, mercenary, exactly the kind of opportunist they could understand and potentially use. "So, the Morrison letter was your work?" Garrett asked. "Mine and others who were paying me. We needed you looking in the wrong direction while we moved people through. It worked for a while, but now Thaddeus has figured it out, and I realize I can't keep playing this game. The railroad doesn't pay well enough to risk what you'll do to me if you decide I'm an enemy." It was a masterpiece of false confession, admitting to deception while concealing the true nature and scope of her resistance. She had just painted herself as someone contemptible but potentially useful, someone motivated by greed rather than ideology. Thaddeus was still suspicious. "How do we know this isn't just another lie? Another layer of deception?" "You don't," Sylvie said simply. "But here's what I can offer. I can give you real information now. Current routes, active safe houses, names of people actually moving runaways. Not the big fish, I don't know those, but enough to make it worth your while to keep me alive and working for you. Real work this time, not games." The silence that followed was the longest of Sylvie's life. Everything depended on this moment. Whether they believed the lie wrapped in a confession wrapped in another lie, whether their need for information was stronger than their desire for revenge, whether she had judged them correctly. Finally, Garrett spoke. "Give us one name, one route, something we can verify right now. If it's real, we'll talk about terms. If it's another lie, we'll make an example of you that every slave in Texas will remember." Sylvie had prepared for this. She gave them a name. A man who had already made it safely to Canada 2 months earlier, whose former safe house was now abandoned. She described a route that had been used in the summer but was no longer active. It was information that seemed current, but was actually historical. Useful enough to verify, but not damaging to anyone still in the network. "Check it out," she said. "Take whatever time you need. I'll be at Mr. Hawthorne's property when you're ready to talk terms." She walked out of the warehouse on legs that shook slightly, but carried her with apparent confidence. Behind her, she could hear them already beginning to argue about whether to believe her, but she had done what she could. The performance was complete. Now everything depended on whether she had read them correctly, whether her understanding of their psychology was accurate. If you've been following Sylvie's dangerous journey from enslaved seamstress to master strategist, this is the moment to show your support. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel for more hidden histories of resistance, drop a comment telling us what you think will happen next, and consider joining our members club. Every subscription helps us continue bringing you these untold stories of courage and survival. The next 3 days were an agony of waiting. Sylvie maintained her routine, working in Hawthorne's kitchen, shopping in the market, giving no outward sign of the turmoil beneath her carefully controlled exterior. Sarah, the pregnant woman Hawthorne had purchased, had arrived and was settling into the household. She watched Sylvie with quiet curiosity, sensing something beneath the surface but wise enough not to ask questions. On the fourth day, Garrett came to Hawthorne's door. He spoke with the merchant briefly, then asked to speak with Sylvie. They walked to a quiet corner of the property, out of earshot of the house. "We checked your information," Garrett said. "The safe house was real, recently abandoned just like you said. The route you described matches reports we've gotten from other sources. So either you're telling the truth, or you're very good at making lies sound real." "I'm telling the truth," Sylvie said, "about wanting to work for you genuinely. I'm tired of playing games. I want steady pay and protection, that's all." Garrett studied her for a long moment. "Pemberton wants to question you himself. He's coming back up from New Orleans next week. You'll meet with him, and he'll make the final decision about whether we use you or dispose of you." The threat was implicit but clear. Sylvie nodded. "I understand. Until then, you're being watched. Don't try to run. Don't try to warn anyone. Don't do anything except exactly what you're told. If you're smart, you'll spend this week thinking about how to convince Pemberton you're worth keeping alive." He left. Sylvie returned to the kitchen, her hands steady as she prepared the evening meal despite the storm of thoughts in her mind. She had bought another week. One more week of freedom. One more week where the network could operate, knowing the catcher's attention was focused on her rather than them. One more week to see if her final trick would work, or if this was where the dangerous game finally ended. That night, she didn't go to the cemetery. There was no point. She was being watched, and any contact with the network would only endanger them. Instead, she lay on her pallet and thought about everything that had brought her to this moment. 15 years of bondage, years of watching and learning, months of playing a role so dangerous it might still kill her, but also months of seeing people escape to freedom because she had created the space for them to run. 37 lives saved during the suspension period alone, countless others protected by the misdirection and false trails she had laid, routes that stayed open because she had drawn the hunter's attention elsewhere. If Pemberton decided she was too dangerous to keep alive, if her confession wasn't believable enough, or her usefulness wasn't clear enough, at least she would die knowing she had mattered, that she had chosen resistance over submission, strategy over surrender, that she had used the only weapons available to her, intelligence, courage, and an understanding of how power worked, to fight a system designed to make her powerless. The trick that everyone thought was a joke had become something far more serious. 10 nights after it began, no slave catcher felt safe in Texas, not because they feared violence, but because they had learned that the people they hunted were far more sophisticated than they had imagined, that behind every escape was not just desperation, but strategy, not just luck, but organization. And at the center of that organization, at least for a few crucial months, had been a woman named Sylvie who understood that the most dangerous weapon against tyranny wasn't force, but knowledge. That the best way to fight a system was to make it fight itself, to turn its own methods and assumptions against it. As she lay in the darkness waiting for dawn, Sylvie smiled. Whatever happened when Pemberton arrived, whether she lived or died, the network would continue. The routes would stay open. People would find their way to freedom, because that was the thing about resistance. It didn't depend on any single person. It was larger than individual courage or sacrifice. It was a web that grew stronger every time someone chose to add their thread to it. Her thread had been woven as deeply into that web as possible, and even if it was cut, even if Pemberton decided she was too dangerous to live, the web itself would hold. The trick would continue long after the trickster was gone. That was enough. It had to be enough. In the distance, a rooster crowed, announcing the arrival of another day. Sylvie rose from her pallet and began preparing for whatever came next, knowing that she had played her part as well as anyone could have. The rest was in the hands of forces larger than herself, justice or fate, providence or chance, the inexorable movement of history toward a freedom that existed somewhere beyond the horizon of bondage. She had bought time for people to reach that horizon, and in a world where time was the most precious currency available to the enslaved, that purchase might be the most valuable thing she had ever done. The final trick wasn't making the catchers believe a lie, it was making them believe they had won, even as everything they sought to control slipped through their fingers like water, even as the very person they thought they had broken continued to resist from within the heart of their own operations. 10 nights after it began, no slave catcher felt safe in Texas, and one woman walked through Marshall with her head held high, knowing that whatever came next, she had earned the right to that posture. She had chosen her own path, fought her own battle, and in doing so, had helped dozens of others find theirs. That was resistance. That was freedom, not the absence of chains, but the presence of choice. Not escape from the system, but the transformation of it from within. Not victory in any conventional sense, but the fierce determination to matter, to make a difference, to refuse the erasure that bondage demanded. And in that refusal, Sylvie had become something far more dangerous than any slave catcher could imagine. A woman who understood her own power and was willing to use it, regardless of the cost. The story of her trick would be told for generations, though most of the details would be lost to time. But the essence would remain, the memory of someone who stood at the center of impossible contradictions and found a way through, who transformed weakness into strength, invisibility into power, submission into resistance, who proved that the most dangerous person in any system of oppression is not the one who rebels openly, but the one who learns to make the system itself serve the cause of freedom. That was Sylvie's legacy, and it was enough.